Public debt is rising amongst governments, with global debt on track to hit 115% of GDP by 2026, as projected by the International Monetary Fund. To discuss this, we are joined today by Hamza Ali Malik from UN-ESCAP. Hamza, what are the primary consequences of rising public debt on a country's economic stability?
Well, more obvious, of course, implication of rising debt levels and rising debt servicing costs is relatively less fiscal space for governments to invest in development in general, whether it's infrastructure, education, health services, sustainable development goals, climate ambitions, so on and so forth. So that's the more immediate and obvious implication of rising debt servicing costs in particular.
Well, thank you for those points, Hamza. And how can a government leader mitigate the top risks as identified by EY?
Well, there's a host of strategies. One of the first things which United Nations is promoting and which ESCAP has been promoting is to understand that high debt levels actually on their own are not necessarily bad. What matters is how the money raised is being spent. So we need to look into the specificities of each country level data differently, rather than imposing more generic policy implications that every country should do ABC things. So for instance, if the debt level is rising and the proceeds and money raised is being invested in development, and as a consequence debt is rising, that's okay. We should not penalize countries for those kind of things. So the distinction needs to be made in the sources of debt distress as a first step, and then devise economic policies.
Thank you. Now, importantly for our viewers, what should be at the top of the agenda for Asian governments as they take on this year's challenges?
From the government's perspective, when looking at the debt challenges or debt distress challenges, one of the first thing governments, I think, I would advise to revisit their debt sustainability assessment approaches. The current approaches used by IMF and World Bank does not incorporate the long-term investment needs for sustainable development goals and climate ambitions and so on and so forth. So they miss out actually on how much investments are needed, what are the potential benefits of these investments on the economy. What we would advise is, and we have developed this kind of tool, what we call augmented debt sustainability assessment tool at ESCAP, which allows you to see the benefits of these investments relative to the rise in debt level, and then assess what kind of policies needs to be done. Just to add to this point, I think from the international community perspective, or those who are involved in advising governments on resolving debt distress, there are three key things that needs to be kept in view. One, the sources of public distress has to be understood very, very clearly. So one key source is economic and fiscal mismanagement. If this is the case, then the onus of responsibility of adjustment rests with the countries. If they're running persistent primary deficits, for instance, countries have to focus on increasing their revenue collections, increasing spending efficiencies, and effective use of the money they raise through debt. That's one. However, if the countries are facing debt distress due to temporary liquidity shocks, then the approach has to be different. If a country can get immediate liquidity support from IMF or other agencies, then they can go back to investments in the development over time, which means in terms of policies, they don't necessarily need to impose stringent fiscal consolidation measures. And the last one is, as I was alluding earlier, we need to recognize that a lot of developing countries need significant investments in sustainable development goals and climate ambitions. So international development community should provide these resources upfront to developing countries rather than dealing with the consequences of once the debt increases. So the distinction between different sources of debt is actually extremely critical when we talk about at the global level how to resolve debt issues, in addition to what countries needs to undertake at the domestic level.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, Hamza.
You're most welcome.
Again, our guest was Hamza Ali Malik, Director of Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for the Development Division at UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. For more news, please visit govmedia.com.